no further ado, I think let's just look at what Pact does. And there is an Australian girl / woman / developer / whatever, who is actually being very, very active. What she's trying to say is, why do we want to use Pact? That's sort of the first couple of minutes that she talks about that. She proposes that if you have if you develop a service and you have that service exposed to a number of customers, then those customers will do some development on their own, and therefore your expectations about what the service would deliver and their expectations about what they would get from the service will eventually diverge. And Pact is a way to ensure that the consumers of the services can tell you what they expect from the service, which means that what they wanted to use for testing of their consumption of the service, that's what you need to ensure that you can deliver. So that's the sort of the contract between them. That's between the consumers and the producer of the service. So if you take it from one consumer, from another consumer, from a third consumer, fourth, and so on, all these things together is what your service needs to be able to live up to. So that's the pact you have. So if another consumer comes by, or if one of the consumers wants to have a new feature, then you can add that feature. And that would be a part of the test or the expected outcome from that customer. But you still have all the other consumers' expected outcomes, and you need to sort of make that happen. That's how the consumers are driving the evolution of your service. Today, if you write like test first code, how many have tried to write the test first code?
I've tried to.
Okay, but that's good enough. That's good enough. So, do you know what a test-driven development is? Mm-hmm. And if you start by writing a test, then you think about what should this something do, and then if you're extreme, you don't have anything but the test. I think that's the sort of the usual example is where you start to write a test, and you don't even have a class, for instance, that is the target of the test. So that would fail. And then you have the class, and then you don't have the method. And then the method, you have the method and the class, but the method is not doing what you actually want it to do. You want to have it to return a 4, and it doesn't do anything. It just returns void, and then you add 4 now, it returns 4, but then if you change the input, then the output should be different. So if it's an operation that multiplies 2 numbers, then okay, if you add 2 and 2, then the result was 4. But if you change one of the 2's to 3, then the result should be 5. And then you actually need to put some logic in there that would be able to take the 2 inputs and return the result. So that's how it works. And this is actually somewhat the same, but the consumers just state, what do I, as a consumer, expect from that endpoint or this portion of endpoints that happens to be a service. And if you do that, and you do that, and you do that, and you do that, then I have 4 different sets of expectations. If I run those 4 different sets of expectations and they work well, then I can upgrade my service, or put the next version of the service into production and feel good about that. This is not the same as it actually works, because if what you have specified, if there are some gaps in there in relation to what the real situation is, then of course you still have some errors you need to deal with. But then you or whoever discovers this error should update their expectations to match now we are getting wiser, so therefore we would add some expectations to that. And Pact is a framework that can be used for exactly that kind of purpose. The great thing about this is that if you have all these scenarios you can go through, and you can specify not only the cause but also the amount of data, the variance of data of input. That means that we can evolve as fast as possible for this one service. And it also means that if you have certain requirements that you bring into your part of the contract, which is not relevant for anyone else, it's okay to include those, and the rest of you should just ignore them. In contrast to the old, some of us have been through the Corporate days and the soap days and so on. It's actually quite okay to add some stuff in there that's only targeted for one customer or one consumer. So it's not like a competition or a quest for being, the sole truth for a particular domain. It's just living up to the expectations of the consumers. There's not necessarily some fancy modeling and stuff going on. As long as you live up to what the consumers expect, that's okay.
You're probably going to touch on this, but I can't help thinking, how do you engage with the consumers? What's in it for them? If you provide an API service, I see that this would be of great benefit. Mm-hmm. How do you get people to contribute?
I think if you're in a business domain where speed, evolution of your applications are sort of at the heart of the matter. If your sole existence depends on you can deliver new stuff to your user of an application, and then you consume a number of different services, you want to have your users experience a stable application. I believe.
So also the use case where your clients are in the same company.
Yeah.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Yes. Talk them into it.
Yeah. So instead of having to go through meetings and these kind of things to actually get the functionalities that you want, you can just specify and ship it off and let others deal with the details. That would be pretty awesome.
Yeah, and definitely if you look at what the Pact specification, it's much more concise than the verbal waffle that's going on a meeting. I don't know. I've been to a meeting or two where you agree on something, and when you go back, then what you thought you agreed on was something completely different than what the other guys thought we agreed on. So and this becomes sort of more concise.
Is the idea to completely remove the power from the service itself? Like, if I want to impose changes to my APIs,
yes.
How do I deal with that with Pact? And if the changes should come from my clients?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you're going like Pact vanilla, then you don't do that, because why would you introduce something that's not being used?
Okay.
Yeah. but of course it's a valid question, because if you as a consumer have asked for something and you ask for something else, and then over the years we discover that isn't that kind of the same, then you might want to consolidate parts of your service.
Just comparing it to how OpenAPI works.
Yes.
That's
and how would you say OpenAPI addresses that? Because that would be interesting to hear, I think.
Yeah, I think that's through versioning, right? So then I can introduce new things in my new versions of the API.
Yeah.
With a new specification.
Yes. But how would your consumers perceive that? But how would your consumers perceive that? If you have, let's say we have this scenario where you have this application with loads of actual active users on it.
Yeah.
If you have a version 1 of your API, of course you can produce a new version, as long as you keep the old one running on the side.
Yeah.
But how do you transfer? And
you could also just take the simpler use case where you add a new endpoint, right?
Yes, but that's really the simple one.
Yeah. But I think it's still a similar use case, because what you would do is upload a new Open API specification, and then your clients could generate a new client that would then accept the models that you have built into the Open specification.
Yes.
So they could use the endpoint if they wanted to.
Yeah.
And still be compliant with the same.
Yeah. But if you let's say your application is a mix of a web application, a iOS application, an Android application, it'll be pretty difficult to make sure that everyone moves from one version to the other. And the more speed you want to have, the more versions you would have to operate in parallel.
Yeah, that's true.
So you have to find some kind of a paradigm that allows you, and that was actually one of the things we talked about at the initial recipe. We can do that again if that's interesting, where you can actually version your service reusing the same endpoints, which means, and if you can control the content in that endpoint, then you can stay compliant within one deployment unit. But the API, Open API versioning does not sort of say that, but you can do it within the scope of what Open API is offering. We can get back to that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be about Open API.
No, that's okay. Open API is clearly a significant part of developing services. So I don't think it's clearly relevant. And by the way, Pact doesn't say anything about what API specification you're using, as far as I know. I think some of the tools state something about using Swagger or whatever. But there are, to my knowledge, there are sort of two different formats. The Open API spec is one, and the API blueprint is another.
Yeah.
And those two are sort of interchangeable.
Yeah.
Different in syntax, but they can do similar things.
Would you have to have a pact with every one of your consumers? I'm thinking if I want to make a change, in principle I could say, because I have these pacts, these contracts with all my consumers, I could say, well, I know that these three guys are using it.
Yes.
So now I'm just going to go and call them and say, V2 is really much, much better. Don't you want to move? But the question, what I was thinking was, well, maybe there's somebody who's just sort of piggybacking on a pact that's I've made with somebody else. They just found it and they're started using it.
Yeah.
Is that something that Pact addresses?
Not that I know of. That's actually a good observation. Yeah, that could clearly happen, because that would save you quite a lot of work.
I guess you could have the same contract with different clients.
Yeah.
So I guess don't you have to present your contract when you call up?
No, I don't think. In my belief, it's not a runtime issue. It's something you do pre-runtime, if you like. That's a part of your quality testing. Okay. And in the same way, as you just mentioned before, you would of course test whether you've added some endpoints or whether you remove some endpoints. If you remove some endpoints, you might be in trouble. If you redefine the way in which the endpoint actually acts. Let's say that everywhere. That's one of the examples we talked about in the first initial meetup. That if you have an endpoint and you return like 200 OK and 404, everyone sort of does that. Then at some point in time, this 200, it's synchronous. So the client would wait for an answer, but something happens and you would ask on the server side to actually get more time, which means it would be deferred. And you can do that within HTTP. You'll return a 202, which says, okay, I understand what you want, but I'm not capable. I can't really deliver right now, but you get a location there. You can find the answer, and you might even throw in a retry header and send that back. And that would mean that on this location at approximately this time, you'll be able to find an answer. If the client programming model is only capable of handling 200s and 404s, that's a broken endpoint. It's not difficult to break the contract, and it's especially not difficult if you forget to include those kind of things in your Open API spec. So a suggestion could be to always include like 202 in the endpoints you have an expectation of some point in time, or at least in foreseeable future will be in a situation where you have to defer some stuff. if you have an idea about your API, which is, if you're not really clear about how your resource design is if you're experimenting with that, then you could also make sure that you include 301, because then you can move one resource to another place and stuff like that.
But that sort of goes against the whole agile thinking. That's big upfront design. You say, okay, and I support 417 on my kettle.
Yes. Yeah. But
because you just put all of them in the beginning.
You shouldn't.
Agile design is more like, okay, I've got 200, I got 404, everything I need, simple as possible. Let's go.
Yeah, but the thing is, again, if you have clients that are using different ecosystems, you might want to choose a small subset that buys you the freedom to actually be able to be agile. Because if you want to be agile in that way, then you can't deploy a new version, because that would break the existing clients. If you have the Pact, then you would know how significant is this. Is this going to pose a problem for anyone?
Put a few words.
Yes, definitely.
So I think that the Pact is best used in the microservice world and in the organizations. So don't think about the public APIs, because that seems to be not the best use case. The best use case is that we are in one organization with several teams, right? Every single team writes its own Pact, and then we are trying to make sure that we are not breaking those microservices somewhere. And the way how Pact is working in the best possible setup is that we are using something called Pact Broker, which is basically a place where all the pacts are being stored and they are accessible by every team. And then they are able to run a verify command as a part of the CI. So once the pacts are not passing, then the deployment should be cancelled, because then one of the pacts is breaking the contract with one of the teams. So that's kind of the best setup you can have with the Pact. Obviously, it is possible to model something like that for the public APIs, but then suddenly you would need to also have an environment that allows you to create some resources and then tear them down every single time you run the verify command. So, yes.
Yeah, but if you have an affiliate structure, that might also apply to that. Yeah, that's a good point. So it's a part of your, like when you built your integration test, your where you have automated performance tests, stuff like that, it would be around the same kind of build step or pipeline.
So basically, when we are talking about Pact, we need to position it somewhere, right? So maybe I'll show you some very good slides.
Yes, do that.
So Pact is basically introduced by guys from Atlassian. So really good presentation. If we are dealing with API testing, then of course the first thing we can do is to write unit tests. And obviously they are cheap, they are fast, they are reliable, they are targeted, but they are not really trustworthy, right? We are mocking all the dependencies, so that's not very good. Then on the other scale, we have integration tests that are super trustworthy, but they are not cheap to write. They are not fast at all. They are not reliable. And usually it's just try and error. If it doesn't work, just rerun it again and see what happens, right? So it doesn't work. Oh, now it works. No control at all. Then you have end-to-end testing. Same thing. Manual testing. We don't like that. So better way, yes, contract testing. Pact. So yes. So Pact is really living outside of the microservice, somewhere between two microservices, and it relies on the Pact files that basically contains the definition of the test. And the Pact files can be shared in 3 different ways. You can use file system, pretty old school URL, or the Pact Broker that I just told you about. So this is exactly the setup that we would like to test, where a bunch of different microservices are working together. And these are the cases that Pact can easily spot. So we suddenly figured out that the object should be called users instead of user. And this is not what we agreed on Pact, and that will be then highlighted. So of course, talking to each other is awesome, but you can avoid talking to each other if you are a developer. Then you can just introduce Pact, and all your problems are gone. So obviously, Pact expects some resources to be created. Pact itself is HTTP based, so you can run all the API calls to create those. But again, they will need to be recreated every single time you run the verified commands. Let's see. Yes. So I know that they are also doing some efforts in regards to Swagger to combine the two, but right now the project is not in a super stable way, or not in a super stable place. So perhaps using the Pact Broker to start for the starter as a part of your CI will be the way to go. Yes. So Pact is trustworthy. It's fast because the syntax for it is pretty much similar to the unit tests. It's reliable because we clearly know when we broke things. It's targeted and it's cheap. So get started now. That was it. In a nutshell.
Yeah, I think that that's fine, but I think that there's a lot of problems with that as well, because
Yes.
what you're doing. Well, I mean, they say that that unit test is not trustworthy because it's mocked, and I would actually argue exactly opposite of that, because you mock the limits of your possible outcomes within a single point, which means that you're independent of data, you're independent of the whatever is happening down that sort of call graph. So you isolate the test to be in one point. I know you can also create pacts that would run in different areas, so you actually know where does it why does it break. But every time you change the data form, and every time you alter your the scope of whatever you can come across, you would have to change the underlying packs, or you would stay at the front as they suggest, which means that it would be very, very much like integration test.
Yeah. So it's also.
Or is this really, really complicated?
I think it's important to know that when packs are failing, then all the teams are immediately informed about why they are failing. So you can figure out whether they are failing because the pack was not written correctly, or there's an actual change in the API. So in this way, people can agree on what will be actually happening. But of course, Pact's approach is not the cure for everything. No. So you should be having definitely some unit tests and also integration tests. It's just yet another approach for testing that is worth trying out, especially when you are dealing with the microservice architecture in your company.
But yeah, I think the main problem with mocking is that you are just testing your mocks, right?
No, then you're doing it wrong. You're definitely doing it wrong then. You have your test subject. You have your unit test that works on your test subject, and you mock the resources for their role in relation to the subject for this particular test. I know that there's a lot of people that do not do this right. There's a bunch of people not doing this right. But you need to think about the test subject and how you operate the test subject, and then mock exactly the amount of resources needed for making this subject being, worked in all possible ways.
But how do you get notified when the what you have mocked changed? I mean, because the mock is static, right?
Yeah, but the mock, normally you would do the setup, inside your JUnit test. Then you set up the resources that the subject uses, and then you do the check after you have worked on your subject.
But you don't read from the actual subject what it exposes, right? So if the actual subject exposes something new or changes what it exposes.
It depends actually.
Oh, okay. But
you can do that, but yeah, normally you would go behind the API if that's what we're talking about. Yeah. Yes, and you work on the API. I thought that when I read about Pact, that parts of the integration tests you could actually throw them away and replace them with Pact, and then you would take the integration tests that would do the verification in relation to data and environment, and making sure that you have like a preamble of is this environment actually correct in relation to the code? Because I think today we mix those two concerns, or well, they have been.
Does it give us any sort of auto-generation tools in terms of generating mock servers or generating a server that actually complies with the contracts?
But that probably then I think you're moving towards stopping or fakes.
No, it's more when I'm working with OpenAPI, I do that partly because I can, for instance, for React Native frontend, auto-generate a TypeScript client that comes with all the models that I have predefined.
Yeah, so you generate your client stubs.
Type checking and all that stuff, which makes it way easier to communicate with. I was wondering if now Pact defines these things so well that you could then auto-generate a server that actually creates a skeleton for you, and then you just have to fill out the logic instead of all the way of it.
There are a bunch of tools, but I haven't really looked into.
When we are talking about the tools, there's this project which is working with the OpenAPI specification. But if you think about it, the Pact itself it's not really dependent on the tools. So you are able to create the broker, which is a standalone tool, but the tests themselves they are written in a JSON-based format. So you are not really dependent on any other tools. And of course, there's support for much of different programming languages to generate those tests. But the actual output of this is simple JSON.
The OpenAPI specification is also just a JSON document, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Generate servers and all that from that. So I was thinking, but maybe they can sort of transpile the Pact stuff into an OpenAPI spec, and then.
I think this is exactly what they're aiming with this project.
But that would be very difficult because what would that mean for your API? If you have the situation we had before where we were 4 different consumers. So how would you make that? Would you take the union of that? Would you take the intersection of that? Would you take the I don't see that semantically. Seems to me like a complete mess.
There might be probably a relatively small finite amount of ways to do that logically. So you could sort of go with 5 standard ways of creating it.
Yeah, could be. I don't know.
Anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. But this was an example of a patch.
So you write these files.
Yes. Yeah.
Good.
And sort of then.
Think about that.
Yeah, that's exactly that was kind of my take on it as well. So what do we achieve? Is this easier than doing the I don't know a integration test with a fake stops I don't know volatile data store underneath that mimics the API or just a NoSQL database with where things are stored in the same way as the resources would be on the API? What do you think?
I think that probably it's not easier, but I think the clear advantage to this is that you don't have to talk. You don't have to communicate. Especially in small teams.
Yeah.
I guess bigger teams as well, but very limited on resources. It's so frustrating.
I would like to ask it. Oh, sorry.
So would that mean if I make a pact with my consumer, if you come back to the HTTP codes from before, if I add a 202 code to my result set and the pact doesn't say anything about 202s, as long as I pass, then I'm good.
Yes.
Because that's my deal with my client.
Yes.
That I can send him a 202 and he will in some way handle it because it's part of the pact. So as long as I fulfill my part of the pact, then he can't blame me.
That was exactly the kind of example I was hoping we could get at. Is that okay?
Yeah.
It is.
Then you are in pre-compliance when a new pact arrives, the one that functionality.
You see, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether it's okay.
Well, it's not wrong.
It's not
standard REST where you say, but you are doing something different, so you are potentially breaking something.
Yes.
And this makes it sort of very explicit. Well, I'm breaking I'm not breaking anything that's important because everything that's important has been written into this pact that we both signed in blood.
Yeah, but I think at least one of the things that I saw online suggested that if you do stuff like that, then you're publishing your idea of what you try to live up to, and have people testing that and using that as a pact on their side. But I don't know how that I don't know how it worked, because they would use something as stuff and they would run their client against that. And I think I saw somewhere else that there is a server that can actually sit in between a consumer and a service endpoint, and then convert the JSON into pacts, and you can derive your pact from there.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, you use whatever programming language you want to generate the skeleton for the pact, but the actual file should be transferred to the broker, and all the pacts are being stored on the broker, and then the CI should be integrated with the broker, and then everything is tested against that. So broker is basically a centralized place where you can read the results and see when the state has changed and when it has changed and when things went wrong.
But the thing is that the call that actually issues the 202 back may not be a part of what's driving the test on the consumer side.
But the calls are verified against the pact as well, right?
Yes, but if you are, I'm just tabulating here, because if let's say Damian changes to the API as you suggested, and for some request you would return the 202. But if it's not a part of what you run against, even though the contract has changed and it's visible that the contract has changed, if you're not issuing that particular call, then you will not experience that as an error. And it might not be, because if you never call that resource, that's okay. Then you don't have a problem. It will be the consumer that calls the resource for the first time without having included that in the consumer pre-testing of the pacts. That's when the things will go wrong. But I don't think it's possible to do it better.
Yeah, I mean the idea with the pacts is also not to test every single possible scenario. The idea is to test the code that you are actually using. So if you are expecting in your running code, in your service, to return 200, then this is what you should be testing. You should not be testing for all sorts of code variations, because that's not the point. The point is to make sure that the code that you are running is not breaking.
Just to finish the flow, so I as a client write this document and submit that to a centralized location.
If you use the pact server, yeah.
Yeah, and then I as a service will then download all the documents or download a sort of combined product of all the packs, and then I will write my unit tests towards that document, or how does that work?
With your run a verification that will execute whatever is stated in the pact. That's a specification, and that you'll get that you'll verify that this endpoint you've deployed somewhere actually works against these pacts and do what is expected.
So I launched like a mock HTTP client that just attacks my endpoints on my local server, and then I get a report on which things are fast or not.
Yeah, okay. It's more or less like if you were doing like a protractor test on an Angular application, you would execute a certain set of endpoints, and you'll get a result back.
I think that's people.
Yeah, so the broker is offering also the web UI, so you can look at all the tests. But if you are only concerned about yours, then it can return results in the same way as you run unit tests. So it'll just show you whether the tests are passing or not.
And is this something that you already used or implemented in a real development flow?
I have no.
If yes, I would like to hear some challenges that you have on the road.
Yeah, so we actually started the other way around. We started with figuring out that we have a challenge with it, and we are trying to address the problem. So we are really into trying to explore what kind of tools we have available, and we really thought that Pact will be great for the end consumer testing because we are running pretty huge public API, but that turns out not to be a good idea. But at the same time, we are running also, for example, mobile kit that relies on our APIs. And this is exactly the area where sometimes we are breaking the contract with them, not really knowing that we did that, because they are running their own tests, we are running our own tests, and nothing is really combined. So we figured out, well, why not to try? So to answer your question, we are not doing it at the moment, but we are definitely considering doing it in the near future. So perhaps on the next session or in 2 sessions, we will be able to give you some actual results.
So are you actually trying to replace some of your unit testing with it?
No, that should be working on top of the unit test.
Completely separate.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it be like too much to have like an effort to have the unit test and follow the integration test and then the fact?
It's never too much.
It can be.
When it comes to the testing, it's especially for these kind of tests that are super fast. They are equally fast as unit tests, and it doesn't really harm our infrastructure to run them on pretty much every single build.
So in fact, why not replace? I mean, why not keep the unit test,
Yeah.
high-level unit testing and replace?
Because you want to test with Pact, you want to test the so I think this image. So you want to make sure that all the microservices that they're using your API can talk to each other, and you are not breaking anything. Where on the unit test, you might be only concerned about your own thing. So that's why they are not really replacing unit tests.
I'd still argue that, the high-level ones, maybe I will say something, but I can't see what you could do with the unit test on the high level and that you can't do with this, because basically what this does is automates your post-man test, your manual test, right? The ones you run, and this is just automating them.
I would argue that if you're using HTTP, you already beyond unit tests. To me, unit test would be, I don't know if everyone else has it that way, but to me, unit test would be a platform internal thing where you have a test driver class with a method that tests one concern in the subject, which is another class, and it's a particular concern in that subject. You test, and then you would have another method, testing another concern that might have target exactly the same method as the one before, but it would not test via the network. As soon as I would move from the inter-process stuff to the network, that in my kind of picture of it, that would be an integration test. I don't know if that's how people see it.
I think the debate is around do those unit tests actually bring you more value when you are covered with something like this?
You're saying that unit test brings more value if you cover it?
No, the question is, do unit tests actually bring more value or bring value when you are covered with this kind of test?
I don't know. How would you know what your coverage is? And I would see it in a different way. But I would look at, if this does not reveal errors, then it's worthless. If you don't find any errors at the unit test level, it's worthless. So don't do stuff that's worthless. You afterwards.
I think this is very useful for replacing the integration testing stuff, but at the integration testing level, it also looked like it was a fairly expensive test to write in terms of client code, where the unit test is typically for testing the outliers on functional level, right? Mm-hmm. And it's really hard, can be really hard to design a test in a way so that you actually get out there in the outliers. Yeah. So I don't think we can replace unit testing.
Because you're trying to sort of cover a certain part of your combinatorics at the unit level. Whereas here, you're trying to sort of make can you say like a statement within a normal distribution of what could happen in this ecosystem. I don't know if that's too hard.
That was sort of what I was going at.
Oh, sorry about that.
But to add on that, this seems like a nice way of decentralizing your tests.
Yes.
You concentrate on the stuff that you have thought of.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do all combinations because you run out of time. But others can contribute with their specific test and then help finding problems. That was actually where I got the intention wrong. I was thinking public APIs. Why do people want to contribute to this? But it's a common goal for everybody to ensure their quality.
But again, if it's I would again say that you could do this in a public setup as well, because if you have a mutual interest in, let's say you offer or you get a portion of the money earned by your consumers of your service, then you are sort of tied into the same kind of economical interests, which means that both parties would be motivated for making this work. I don't know.
But then suddenly it's very heavy from the infrastructural perspective, because we need to offer, so let's say we have, 1,500 integrations running, so you need to offer pretty much sandbox environment for every single one of those partners. And then suddenly those tests are not cheap to run.
No, but what you could do otherwise would perhaps have this is what you call it. It's just not argument. So if all your consumers would be offered a branch in your repository, then you would have that engine running actually as a part. So you would offer that as a service for your consumers that you could run. So it might be doable.
But in the difference between these tests and unit tests, would you put into your Pact that I have this calculation function? If I call it with 3 and 4, it returns 12. And if I call it with 2 and 7, it returns 14. That's stuff that you would go into a unit test. I'm thinking that I would not put, like you were mentioning, all the edge cases into my Pact. They would go into my unit test of that my calculation works the way I expect it to. So I think they probably both have a place still.
But the integration test could be replaced by this, right?
Except the ones that actually verifies that the things you need from the underlying infrastructure is that what I'm doing right now is actually working on the data spread, the database drivers or whatever. So it's the verification part at least probably needs to be there still, because I don't think that Pact does not address that. It's the difficult, because it's like it is an integration, but it's a technical integration. It's not like a functional verification. And I think Pact is about the functional verification.
So it's just to describe those are functions. Those are kind of easy ones. But if you have persistence state low, it's always
then it gets a little tricky. Yeah.
Where do you get the data from? What data is available? And
Yeah.
how do you initialize it?
Yeah.
Test and all that.
Yeah.
You get an expensive setup and tear down, right? But you need to just roll it back to, okay, now I need to have a database state that looks like this, which is typically an expensive proposition.
But what you could do is you could have like a container with a predefined data set that is statistically representative, and you could work against that. And if you then find errors afterwards, you need to adjust that, because then your hypothesis about what would be statistically representative was not complete. So that would be that's just another dimension of trying to have this very sort of feedback-based approach. If we look at contractual testing, I actually, this is, by the way, throw tomatoes at me, because this is a shameless self-promotion actually. But I've done some work on API testing. So what you talked about just before is actually something that I worked quite a lot on. On GitHub, there is an organization called Open API Tools, which is my alter ego, which is this with an E. That's my private setup. Whereas without the E, that's my professional GitHub. So this is private work, and what this is about is actually taking one API version 2. An Open API version 2 spec, and comparing that to another Open API version 2 spec. So it looks after what you told me before, whether something has been removed, whether something has been added, but then it also looks at what has changed. And I don't think there is, at least I didn't find any tools that goes deep into that analysis of what is actually changed, and in order to do so, I found myself having to be opinionated. So this is a strongly opinionated tool, and it takes its starting point in this ability to version content and structure in 2 different dimensions, which means you can reuse the endpoints. Okay. So and this means you can take your old API and you can take your new API, and then you can compare those 2, and then you'll get a report of whether something definitely breaks, potentially breaks, or if it's okay. And if the old API does not include some of the stuff we talked about before, I chose a subset of things that I wanted to include. It might not be the subset that's what you want, but I choose to include that, and that's what I'm testing for. So if your existing API does not have these things, it will suggest to improve your API with those things. But of course you can run it. It's an ordinary Maven project as it is right now. I know there are companies in Denmark that are using it as a part of their pipeline to check whether they are releasing stuff that's not compliant. And if you want to free the developer of the hassle of writing all this kind of stuff into the code, because that's a pain to write all this stuff, there's also some tooling that will at some point in time be available that would actually pass the API spec emitted from your service and putting those things, your minimal set, into the API specification, and then you can publish that. So, but this works. We can work it in different modes, but it's using content types to do the versioning. So if you have an endpoint that serves users, for instance, as we saw before, you have users, and you would get a list of users back. Then in that response, you would get a content type that would tell you that this is, for instance, application/JSON or application/how+JSON, semicolon concept, which is equal to the projection, default user list, semicolon, D equals a version number. What does that mean? That means as if a consumer asks for application/JSON or application help.json, they'll get the newest version. If this doesn't work for you, then you can change your accept header to the version that worked for you. And in that endpoint, the service will revert to the old version, which means there's no structural change there. Okay? So that's kind of an easy way to be able to host multiple versions of the same service inside the same kind of code unit.
We found a way to express which versions are available. Yes,
that's another thing. I don't think I checked for that yet, but we use if you issue a GET towards an endpoint and you put your accept header to application / JSON semicolon concept equals metadata, that would return the history and the versions and the meta information about that endpoint. Yeah. So. And if you want to see an example of how it works, there is also samples there, and you can just use it if you want. But this is my spare time, so yeah. So sometimes it takes. And you can get reports in different situations. But it will also look at, for instance, if you have a header and you have defined a regular expression that would define what's in that header, or path param, or query param, and so on, it would look at whether the regular expression has changed. But I cannot, and I don't think anyone can, define whether that new regular expression is a subset of the old one. That's not possible to do within polynomial time. So I'll just make you aware of that it's changed. So go and have a run. And if you find errors, let me know. Then I'll try to fix it. Yeah, so there's a simple report taken into GitHub here, and of course you can run it and do your own take on it, and you'll see here that there was no removed endpoints, there was no added endpoints, but otherwise they would have been here. But there's a lot of things that actually changed. So it will say something about what potentially breaks, what's breaking, and it will also suggest at some point in time where. What should you actually consider to include in your existing API in order to make it capable of evolving faster?
Can it somehow be integrated into Swagger?
Actually, I have had a dialogue with Tony Chan from Swagger. But that was before I was hired in the place I'm hired right now, so I'm not talking that much to Tony anymore. But he showed a certain interest as far as I could tell that, and they were, as far as I understood it on his mail, they were doing something, or they were approaching some kind of functionality that would look like that. So, and being where I am right now, I'm of course having or attempting to have a dialogue on these kind of things in Apiary as well. And I have been working on implementing some of this as style rules, style guides ruling. So, but the event model and stuff is you only get an event if something's there. So you have a causality issue in the current model, which probably needs to be addressed. Otherwise, you need to do something like that on the side, and maybe they want to do that. I don't know.
API was bought by all.
Sorry?
API was bought by all.
Yeah, it is.
Convenient.
Yeah, yes.
Cool.
But I mean, if you want, you can have. I don't know if there's any other tools. I know there are other tools that are doing the API diffs, but I'm not aware of anyone that actually goes in and works with that depth. And the opinionated stuff is also about this version thing. So you can specify the number of overlapping versions you want to run, and then it will check that these number of overlapping versions also exist.